Hi there. Now this is a quick video showing you how I use my brushes. So yeah, let's get going. So the thing that I already want to mention to you is that I've organized my brushes in a way where I actually follow a process. So the very first that I have is the blueprint, then I have sketch, line art, and then coloring and effects. And these are all organized in a way where, the first step that I do with my drawings is actually do the blueprint. So the blueprint phases for me is that, I have a brush specifically for drawing very loose, like, brush strokes. So when the brush actually is something that supports the idea that you are, either creating a sketch or then, just drawing something and trying to get something to the canvas. So the the blueprint brush is specifically done for that. So I could draw like a very, quick face or something, and then the brush actually supports the fact that I cannot do too much, detailed work. So it has to be very loose kind of work because the brush is very, not supporting any detailed work or anything like that. So I have, the sketch brush for more detailed work. And the end result with the blueprint brush is usually something like this. I have already used like a bit of the sketch brush, but you can still see that the sketch or the blueprint, brush creates this very, pencil-like effect for the drawing. So yeah, blueprint is the first step and the first, brush that I use when I start my drawings. So after I've created some kind of blueprint, the next step is to do a sketch. So I use the sketch brush for that. So it's more detailed and has a, a sharper kind of edge for, drawing more detailed work. So it's easy to adjust, the opacity and brush density, and it quickly gives you very, precise, defined lines for your sketch. And what I like the most about this brush is actually the texture that's in it. So that's a custom texture that I've created for this brush, and it gives you very, pencil-like effect, and I like this brush a lot. So I use it, well, it's actually the main brush or the main sketch brush that I use, kind of like the only one. So I don't actually have anything, more than just one sketch brush, because the fact is that when you know your brushes inside and out, then you kind of like don't need more than actually just one for a given task. Because the fact is that, of course, I couldn't do like cell shading with this kind of brush. So this is, for sketching, another brush for line art, and, for effects and so on and so on. So we have like different brushes for different use cases. And for sketching, I only have this one because I don't need another one. So when the sketch is done, it usually looks something like this. So this is just an example. And, then I usually do also the terminal lines. So you have like the shading lines for the drawing too. So then it's easy when you go and do the line art, it's easy to just follow the lines. And yeah, that's kind of like the sketching stage of my drawing process. Now, after I've used the blueprint, sketch, then comes the line art. So you can see that first I started with the blueprint, sketch. Now we are in the line art. I have few line art brushes. So we have like the anime line art, manga, cinematic, and rough, line art rough, and then retro. So all of these behave quite differently. Anime line art brush is kind of like gives you varied line width. So you can either do like super thick or super thin with the same brush. So it's all depending on how much you put pressure to your drawing tablet and then it gives you very, nice lines. It might take a bit of, time to get used to this kind of brush, but the thing that I like the most is the fact that you only need to have one brush to draw thick and thin lines, because when you're drawing the line art, I usually draw it in one seating, so it's nice to have one brush size, and then you don't get this disruption to the workflow or drawing flow that you have, because you don't have to change the brush size and you don't have to change the brush to draw thin or thick lines. So that's the reason why I like this brush a lot. Then we have the manga line art, and this is pretty much the same brush, except that it has this nice little kind of like texture. So in the line art, the previous brush, you don't have that, but with the manga line art, you have this kind of like nice little texture on the edges. Then we have cinematic brush. This is when I draw, cinematic stuff. So when I'm aiming for a very, like a still key frame from an anime series, movies, then I use this kind of brush. So it gives only one brush size, but it's slightly customized to give the correct brush strokes, the flow and everything. So slightly customized. Then yet again, the line is very, sharp. So then we have the line art rough, and it gives you this kind of like edge for the brush. So it's a more rough edged brush. Then we have the retro. This is a special one because this kind of like combines. So for example, when we have the sketch brush, it gives you this kind of like effect. But when you have a solid brush like this, you can see that there's no transparency or texture in it. The retro brush is actually a combination of two, so it has a solid kind of like vibe in it, but it also has texture in it. So it has both. So then in the end result, it gives you, this kind of like a retro feeling for the line art. So it's pretty darn cool. And when the line art is finished, it usually looks something like this. So this was done with the anime line art brush. And as you can see, you have these, thin lines, but also these thick lines. So this is kind of like what it looks like in the end when the line art is done. Now when the line art is done, I move on to cell shading. So this is the stage where we are when, the line art is done, and then it's up to us doing the cell shading. There are a few methods that I use. Recently I've used Terminator lines to do the cell shading, but in the old days I just went and, used this brush to do the cell shading. So all I need to do is, either, block out certain parts like this, and then, use the fill tool to fill the parts. So this is one way to do cell shading. Super easy. You just, you kind of draw the Terminator lines, and then you just fill the parts. So that's one. Another one that I used in the past is to just, manually drawing all the, areas that should be cell shaded, and, slowly building the form for the shape. So pretty straightforward. Nothing special with this brush. It's slightly customized, not much. So, but then again, it gives me precisely the results that I'm looking for from a cell shading brush. And the end result is more or less looking like this. So now you can see that we've used the cell shading brush to do the highlights, secondary shadow, key light, and stuff like that. So this is kind of like how it looks like when all the shading is done more or less. Then we get to effect brushes. So I, think like airbrush, gradient brush, these are already effect brushes. So even though this is an airbrush. So the way I use these brushes, and I think the airbrush is actually like not customized at all. But usually the way I use these is that I use them at a very big size, because if you use like in a very small size, it's too noticeable and it usually doesn't look that good. So the way I use them is have a very big, area, and then, or the brush size is super big, or the biggest there can be, and then just do different effects for the drawing. So for example, I could add glow and then have some color and then do this kind of effect for the drawing. So that's kind of airbrush, super, basic. Then we have the cloud brush. This is actually pretty fun. It might take a bit of time to get used to. So, maybe I will just use like a dark or, just black, so you can see how it looks like. So it gives you these cloud-like, smoke-like brush strokes, and then when you select the eraser or transparent, you can erase parts that you don't like. And it gives you this smoke-like effect. And if I would be drawing smoke for this drawing, it would look something like this. So I choose the correct color or good color for this drawing, something like that. Then just draw some, fog, smoke for the drawing like this. And it looks pretty darn good. So that's kind of like how it works. So that's an effect brush. Then we have fine dust. It's a very fine dust brush. So I will try to show it to you. So it creates like this super fine dust very quickly. It's pretty efficient. Even, thinking like it creates quite a lot of noise for the drawing, but it's still super fast, because sometimes, when you have like super customized brushes, it could be that it will just slow down your drawing process a lot, because there's so much that the Clip Studio Paint's brush engine has to do. Like it has to work a lot of stuff. So, but then again, this brush is very, efficient. Then we have another fine dust. So it's, just giving you these small dots here and there, and easily, you can change the color of the brush and so on. So super basic stuff in a sense. Then we have particle brush, and it's easily shown with this drawing. So all you need to do is just, draw these particles in, change the brush size, and it will give you very, random like spots to the canvas. And then you can modify from there and do some cool stuff, So yeah, that's kind of like, yet again, pretty basic, but gives you so good results, like super awesome results. Then we have a few other particle brushes, and I can show you those. So here's another drawing that has, we have these particles that you can see here, but then we have the particle number 2, which is that. So it's that brush, and it just gives so cool stuff. So yet again, it's very, randomized. So you can just go over the drawing, and it will, give you these random spots here and there, and then you can, erase the parts that you don't like and leave the ones that you do like. As a last brush that I want to show you is the magic brush. So this is super cool. So you need to have some kind of color for this to work, and yeah, it will just give you these random colorful spots for your drawing, and it will, change the hue of these dots when you draw these spots to the canvas. I also want to show you the rain brush, because this is actually super cool. So what you need to do is just select the brush size that you like, it doesn't matter, then draw these kind of stuff here, and then you just filter, blur, motion blur, and then 90 degrees strength. And look at that. Like, this looks so awesome. Then you just, reduce the opacity a bit and stuff like that. And then you add some effects here and there. It looks so good. But yeah, it's kind of like you usually get like rain brushes that just give you the effect instantly. So you just draw this stuff here and then it's like done. But with this brush, you actually have to do the motion blur. And it's only a good thing because it kind of gives you so good effect for the rain. It just looks so good. So that's about the rain. I don't know, there are many more brushes like leaves and stuff like that, and even a grass brush, and yeah, there's like plenty of them. I'm planning on doing more because I have certain goals I want to do. And then we have a kind of like a calligraphy kanji brush. This was actually pretty hard to do, but I was able to do these anyway. But yeah, these were quite hard to create, these brushes, but they give you so cool effect. Like, this is like so cool. And remember, when you use the the transparent stuff, that's like super cool stuff. Like, just I would definitely learn to use this erasing, deleting method, whatever that is called, transparent brushing, painting, whatever. So yeah, that's about my brushes and how I use them. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. You kind of like know more about this. And then I have some flower brushes like that. But yeah, so different brushes for different use cases. The ones that I use the most: blueprint, sketch, then cinematic, cell shading, coarse, and then gradient, smoke, particles. Actually, the particle number 1 is my favorite one. And yeah, but I'm planning on creating more brushes for different use cases. But yeah, hopefully you enjoyed the video. This was a short, quick one for the brushes, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.